Hello everybody and welcome back. So here we do fire and ecology, and look at this. There we go. Okay, awesome. So fire ecology is its own field of study. Complicated, extremely important. No joke. It is its entire world, essentially. What do we need to understand? So organisms adapt to the stressors of their environment. We talked about this with natural selection, right? So things end up adapting to be able to survive and reproduce, right? Or really, it's more the things that don't adapt, don't survive and reproduce and get exited from whatever system it is. Fire is going to be one of those stressors from the environment, right? And stressor is a term that can sometimes seem bad. We'll talk about why this is neither bad nor good, right? And we can also talk about how all information is really a stressor, right? This is a sort of secret extra abiotic factor that we didn't mention. Why didn't we mention it? Because it's only really important in some biomes, right? In some ecosystems, some contexts, and not others. It's not universal. But in particular, shrublands, grasslands, deserts, like, we have, fire is very important. But not all the fires are good, right? Okay. Small fires, regular fires, the kind of fires that happen that aren't caused by people, that aren't magnified by human beings, are good. Extreme fires that happen whenever human beings make mistakes or are foolish tend to be bad, right? We do have to get the concept nailed down on this one because it comes up in so many places. So real quick, all right. We've got this box, right? It says fragile, do not shake, right? Do not stress it out. The more you stress this thing out, the worse it gets. Not everything's like that, right? So some things are adaptive things, like dogs, just as an example. Human beings as well, right? But dogs need stress. In order to grow, in order to develop, to be happy, healthy dogs, they need stress. They need a good kind of stress, the healthy kind, right? What makes it the good kind of stress? It is acute, right? It is time limited. It is predictable. It is of a known duration, right? Exercise, discipline, recreation, playing, right? Stressors that are good, right? And in fact, it is bad for dogs if you deny them those stressors. Or the same might be true of a human being. A human being who doesn't experience any stress at all, actually, as a fact, is going to show signs of aging more quickly than all but the very most stressed human beings in the entire world, right? Or we could imagine, human beings who are extremely isolated, right? They are no longer getting stressors, and that really hurts them. Or somebody who is confined to a bed for long periods of time. Not good. On the other hand, some things are like washing machines, right? Does a washing machine get better as you stress it out? I hope not. If it does, let me know, because I would be really interested in that, right? The more you use this thing, the more it breaks down. It responds to stress by getting worse, all right? These are categorically different things. We cannot treat them as being the same. We cannot look at them as being the same. And actually, there's a third category of things. It's like, the vastness of space, where it doesn't care what you do to it. It's not adaptive or fragile. It is indifferent. But we're not going to talk about that. We don't worry about it. Point is that ecosystems are adaptive things. They need stressors. To deny them stressors actually makes them worse, right? Things need fire as a stress. Now, there is this entire topic, we'll come back to it with water resources especially and lay into it, of the way that human beings and their views of nature have changed over time, right? Over hundreds or even thousands of years. So the old view was kind of simplistic, right? That fire was bad, and therefore suppressing fire, trying to prevent any and all fire whatsoever, was good. This is not unlike an idea that, stress is bad, and therefore I'm going to intervene in this person's life to make sure that they never experience any stress. It's not good, so stop doing that. All right. The view is that nature was something to be, feared, right, and hated, and it was cruel and unconquerable, and yet at the same time, it was like your divine mission or duty to conquer it, right? And you could, because you were a human being, and the rest of it is not, right? You had this power. It was all within your dominion, and in fact, you were created to rule over all of it, right? Now, these are explicitly Christian ideas. And I say that not to single anybody out or to discriminate against anybody in any way whatsoever or to do any demonizing, but because it is true. And the history of views about nature, the history of the United States as a country, the history of the entire world cannot be separated from the history of Christianity. And that is not my fault. I did not do that. This idea that, wilderness or wilder places or people who might have been associated with those places by some groups, right? That they needed to be dominated, it was good to dominate them, that was beneficial and right, that it was your duty to do so. This idea has been extremely harmful and has led to justifications of things like genocide and ecocide as well, which are literally the worst things in existence. So that's why we have to talk about them and put this into context, right? So this is an idea sometimes called the fall, right, which is what wilderness represented. It's hard for me to overstate just how fundamentally ever-present and important, like more important than anything else in the whole world, these ideas were to human beings for a long time, especially human beings who were European. Now, this changed very gradually over a long time, starts to really get kick-started around maybe the Enlightenment, and then speeds up with industrialization through the 19th century, starts to really get a kick about 1870, right? Yeah, J.W. Powell and Teddy Roosevelt be important figures. We will come back to Powell in particular when we talk about water resources. Extremely important, intelligent person who was far beyond their time, right? Teddy Roosevelt had this idea of creating national parks, greatly expanding protection of wilderness areas. It was definitely a shift, a departure from the way that things were seen previously. Early 1900s for that. The modern view starts to emerge in early 20th century, but really the modern view of fire, right, as not something to be suppressed or exterminated, but something to be managed and largely not intervened with, unless you have to, right? Or in the form of controlled burns, starts to emerge later, all the way up until the 70s and 80s, depending on where you are and who you ask, right? Fire is essential to these environments. It's good, just as an example, right? So a lot of gymnosperms, a lot of things which have these uncovered seeds, not flowers or fruit or anything else like that, like pine trees, a lot of them need fire to actually break open the shells of the seeds and allow them to grow. In other words, they have to have fire in order to be able to do what they do. To deny them the fire is to harm them. Fire can have benefits and harms on the soil, right? What determines whether it's beneficial or harmful is whether the fire is crazy intense and burns through everything, or is of a more regular intensity, right? And doesn't completely fry everything in the soil. So yeah, the dose makes the poison is the phrase here. Applies with a lot of things. Applies with carbon dioxide, it applies with this, applies with radiation, right? Dose makes the poison on fire in soil. A little bit is good, too much kills everything. The effects, right? So it's going to evaporate water, putting all this energy into it. It's going to combust organic matter, which is extremely combustible and contains things that will light on fire very easily, are extremely rich and burnable. It's going to form some new stuff like charcoal. And importantly, it's going to leave behind soil that is extremely rich in nutrients and just ready for new things to come in and grow out of that soil, except for nitrogen, which does have to get put back in there. A lot of the nitrogen is released back into the atmosphere, so you have to have nitrogen fixers come in first. Fire can be something that is helpful for plants, but it is also something that they have to adapt to, and there are different ways that different plants adapt to this. It's not all the same. It can be very difficult to predict, it can be very difficult to generalize with this, so I've included specific examples, right? So first example is this thing. So this is a lodgepole pine, mostly just a regular pine tree, but you remember these little seeds, right, that need fire to break open? Those are what they grow into, right? Others, yeah, so some will have seeds that are only activated by certain chemical compounds which are present in smoke, which has many different chemical compounds in it. Whenever it senses that chemical compound, it releases, like, the seed to begin and go and germinate, right? And one of the reasons we can think that this might be is because after a fire you have really fertile soil. So it's like, hey, this is a good time. This is a time for me to take advantage, right? Very common, right? Organisms die and seeds live. I guess that's poetic too. Some things hide underground, so this is common with like eucalyptus trees. They'll essentially put these deep buds into the ground to where even if the organism above dies, that there is a backup plan. It's basically like an underground bunker for plants. Others, right, this is, I believe, from Africa. I'll have to look up exactly where this is from. These grow tall to the point where whenever fire comes through, right, it burns out the lower stuff, but these vulnerable, green leafy bits that are important to the trees are okay. So we have some images here. I've included this. So this is from a wildlife reserve in Florida. A little bit jungly, not quite like our desert, but I just wanted to show in some images, right? Worth 1,000 words. So this is before the fire. This is immediately after the fire. Notice that for the most part, it's the stuff down low, right? Underbrush, surface stuff that is wiped out, not the stuff that is higher up. In areas like this with tall trees, you divide fires into different types, right? Some that burn the upper stuff, some that burn the lower stuff. In Arizona, we don't usually need to do that because we don't get stuff that's that tall, generally speaking, right? We notice, right, things start to fill in, right? We have a certain community which comes back at first, right? And at first it's really not very rich, mostly dominated by this shrubby stuff, individual outliers, kind of samey, right? But over time, right, gets denser with each one, more complicated, more variety, more different kinds of things, right? Until, you know, if you look at this final picture and you look at the first one, they're pretty similar. In fact, if anything, to my eye, the last one actually looks a little bit richer, a little bit healthier, apart from maybe some dried out leaves here, right? Puts it into context, right? Things recover from fire, it makes them better, if even necessary. This leads directly into a concept that we're just going to touch on now. We could talk a lot about it. There's a lot that we could talk about here. Just dipping our toes in, ecological succession, right? So we have certain communities that come into an environment, right? For example, an environment that has been devastated by fire, right? You'll have some species that come in first, right? That are the so-called pioneer species who are able to essentially get on without other organisms, and those kind of lay the ecological groundwork for the next community, which builds off of whatever they process, nutrients they release, right? Which sets the stage for a more complicated community to come in, right? All the way up to these things that are sometimes called climax communities, right? The final stage, most developed, healthiest, most complex community of organisms that can live in a particular environment, right? But this process can take a long time, something like hundreds of years in some cases, from simple all the way up to the most complicated stuff. And for now, that's all that we really need to know for ecological succession. And maybe we can remember that one example of what can lead to this kind of a reset is a fire, or even something that's more devastating. You can have areas that are wiped out by lava flows, just completely vaporized, worse than any fire could do. What happens is we have an ecological succession. So this is extremely generalized, and there's multiple types of succession that can happen depending, right? Start off, we've got our devastated environment, just bare rocks. We have our lichens and algae, have our small animals, shrubby plants, hardy stuff, comes back, slowly kind of building from the ground up, similar to how here after the fire, right, we were slowly kind of building from the ground up, right? All the way eventually to our climax community that is the most important and complex and healthy, that is most biodiverse and good. And that's all we're going to say about fire and ecology for now. Next, we talk about fire and humanity and human health.